Familiar with the BLM, I think it's good to begin with some background. The Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, is a federal agency that operates as part of the Department of the Interior. It was created in 1946 by combining the General Land Office and the U.S. Grazing Service, two agencies that played a big role in the settlement of Western United States. Currently, the BLM manages about 245 million surface acres across the West. That's roughly 1 in 10 acres of land in the United States. And all these acres belong to the American public. These lands have a variety of resources, including vegetation, grazing for livestock, wildlife habitat, wild horses and burros, energy, minerals, and cultural resources. The mission of the agency is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. BLM land is mostly located in 12 Western states, including Alaska. And in some states, like Nevada, BLM manages a significant share of all lands. All of the orange in this map are BLM managed lands. With so many diverse resources and a mission focused on sustaining multiple uses, the BLM has many different interests to consider and manage. In 1976, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, was passed to guide federal land management decisions. FLPMA dictates that BLM must manage its lands for multiple use and to sustain the health and productivity of the land into the future. This is done through periodic and systematic inventory, also considered monitoring, and that's coupled with land use planning process that prevents undue and unnecessary degradation of BLM lands. So how does an agency this large and diverse carry out the policy of monitoring and sustaining multiple uses over multiple generations? Well, in 2004, a review of BLM's monitoring program by the Office of Management and Budget found that while BLM had monitored at a project level successfully, it was unable to report on the status of BLM public lands nationally. And while the BLM has historically produced valid data at the local level, it was not possible to combine these data and analyze the status of BLM lands at a larger scale. So by 2011, the agency developed the AIM strategy with implementation beginning in the state of Nevada. And the purpose of the strategy is to use a standardized approach that allows the agency to understand what is happening on the landscape at multiple different scales and with multiple resource protocols that are consistent with those of other agencies. The objective of the AIM strategy, or Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Strategy, is to provide a standardized approach for measuring natural resources, the natural resource condition and trends on BLM public lands. It provides quantitative data and tools to guide and justify policy actions, land uses, and adaptive management decisions. AIM data are used for landscape management decisions at multiple different scales, from restoration treatment effectiveness at an individual site to reporting on the national condition of rangelands. Collecting the data the same way across multiple different scales allows the data to be collected once and used many times. It's a very forward-thinking strategy, and it's been exciting to work within the BLM and on this program. So I want to talk briefly now about the 5 principles of AIM. The program was built around these 5 principles, and they are applied to any of the protocols that are underneath the program umbrella. That is structured implementation, standardized field measurements, appropriate sample designs, data management and stewardship, and integration with remote sensing. I'll say just a few things about each of these, and then we'll talk about them later as they apply to the Lentic program that we've helped develop. The structured implementation means that the AIM program provides a foundation on which practitioners can base their local and state monitoring programs. And this keeps people out in the field offices from reinventing the wheel. The National AIM team, which is based out of the National Operations Center in Denver, Colorado, provides timelines and guidance on achieving monitoring goals, as well as training for quality data collection. Standardized field measurements or protocols allow data comparisons throughout BLM and in collaboration with partners. The data can be calibrated across users to minimize bias and can be applied across multiple ecosystems. Principle 3 is appropriate sample designs, which are used to decide where to locate sample plots. The National AIM team supports the development of sample designs, and they work very closely with BLM field offices to ensure that the sample designs are appropriate for the management decisions at the local scale. These sample designs can be generated randomly to minimize bias, or they can be targeted to address specific management questions. The points are then given to field crews who visit the points and establish sampling plots. The AIM strategy also prioritizes data quality and active data management. Historically, data were kept on paper data sheets and in filing cabinets or in boxes, or even on individual computers. But this created problems over the years because the data were not used or shared and could be lost. The AIM strategy ingests all of AIM data into a national database where it is protected from loss and provides access to more people and for more applications. And then lastly, integration with remote sensing. Because there isn't enough time or resources to visit every single point on the landscape, remote sensing is an important tool in the AIM toolbox. To help understand what is happening across the landscape, it's helpful to rely on tools and models created to apply inference across larger areas. AIM data are fed into remote sensing products such as bird's eye view of vegetation cover, landscape trend analyses, habitat mapping, treatment effectiveness modeling, and remapping of national landscape data sets. The original protocol developed for the AIM program was focused on sagebrush and grassland ecosystems, which is the primary land cover types on BLM land. And this area of the AIM program became known as terrestrial AIM. Development of the AIM protocol and ongoing interpretation of the data are supported by a partnership between BLM and the USDA Agricultural Research Service and the Jornada Rangeland Research Program at New Mexico State University. This is the manual that they use, the monitoring manual for grasslands, shrublands, and savanna ecosystems. Shortly after the terrestrial AIM program was developed, the BLM initiated a stream monitoring program called Lodic AIM. This area of the AIM program is supported by a partnership with the National Aquatic Monitoring Center, also known as the Bug Lab, which is based at Utah State University. But after several years of monitoring terrestrial lands and streams, BLM realized that there was a need to monitor systems that aren't quite Lodic and aren't quite terrestrial, lands that we might otherwise call wetlands and riparian areas. These areas cover much less than 1% of BLM lands, but they provide a host of important ecosystem services like those that I discussed with Rob in the very beginning. So while we generally think of BLM land as sagebrush country, BLM lands do contain a diversity of wetland resources. Here's just a few images of wetlands on BLM lands. And where there's water in a dry landscape, we all flock to it, including recreationists, recreationists, wildlife, and livestock. So these are areas that experience a fairly high intensity of use on BLM land. So out of the need to monitor these specific wetland and riparian environments, BLM developed its third AIM protocol, referred to within the BLM as Lentic AIM. And the wetlands team at CNHP was chosen as the outside science partner to support the development of the Lentic AIM program. So now we have the three sides of the AIM triangle that allow BLM to comprehensively monitor the majority of their lands. To give you a scale of the data collection within the AIM program, this map is is a bit more than a year out of date, but it still shows the impressive scale that we're talking about here. As of January 2020, the AIM database contained nearly 27,000 plots of terrestrial AIM data, which I believe now is getting closer to 30,000 plots, 2,500 reaches of Lodic AIM data. And at this point, it had our first initial 64 plots of Lentic AIM data, which was doubled in the 2020 field season. So now I'm going to shift to talking about our partnership and the role that CNHP has played. I'm going to talk more about our partnership developing the Lentic AIM program, and then a little bit about our role collecting Lodic AIM data. The best way to tell the story of CNHP's involvement in Lentic AIM is through what I consider the 3 phases of its development. The first phase was protocol development and testing, which lasted from 2014 to 2018. The initial steps, initial years of 2014, about 2014 to 2016, involved a series of internal meetings within BLM to discuss the need for a wetland monitoring protocol. In early 2017, CNHP was brought onto the development team because BLM recognized the need for an outside science partner with expertise in wetland monitoring. Throughout 2017, the development team met both in person and with frequent conference calls, working towards an initial draft of the protocol, which was produced in spring 2018. That summer, individual members of the development team tested the protocol in their home states. And Sarah Marshall and I, here pictured, from CNHP, took the protocol out to the Gunnison Basin and South Park for a week to test its feasibility. So what is the Lentic AIM protocol, and what did the development team come up with? Here's the cover of our 2020 review draft of what we call the Field Protocol for Lentic Riparian Wetland Systems. It was developed through an interdisciplinary collaboration between the BLM National Operations Center, us at the Natural Heritage Program, and members of and staff from U.S. Forest Service who were quite interested in the development of this protocol as well. The protocol draws on existing protocols within the AIM program, including the terrestrial and Lodic AIM protocols, as well as the multiple indicator monitoring protocol within BLM, and then additional aspects of the protocol draw on EPA's National Wetland Condition Assessment. The protocol can monitor a variety of different systems that meet the following criteria. We have to have at least 10% canopy cover of perennial vegetation, so we don't monitor areas that are bare of vegetation or have only annual vegetation. A dominance of hydrophytic vegetation, or what we consider wetland species. Hydrology dominated by lentic or slow-moving surface or groundwater. Surface water shallower than 50 centimeters, so we don't go into very deep water because it's more difficult to collect the type of data that we're collecting when water is above 50 centimeters. And it's important that the area accommodate 75 meters of transect length. Riparian and wetland systems are characterized by specific hydrology, soils, and vegetation. In this example, permanent saturation from a perennial spring leads to high organic matter in the soils and vegetation dominated by wetland species such as bulrush. There are many different combinations of these 3 characteristics that can occur in wetlands and riparian areas across the West, but these are the 3 characteristics that make a wetland or riparian area. This slide contains several of the applicable ecosystems that can be sampled with the Lentic AIM protocol. We can sample seasonal wet meadows, permanently saturated fens, riparian shrublands, flooded marshes, swales or vegetated drainage ways, and riparian floodplain forests, among many other types. The Lentic monitoring protocol involves several different options for plot layouts because wetlands and riparian areas occur in a variety of shapes and sizes. All options are designed to monitor a specific area of wetland and riparian vegetation, and may or may not encompass an entire wetland because they can really range in size. So our plots are between 300 and 3,000 square meters, 3,000 being the standard size. But we can sample things much smaller as long as they can accommodate 75 meters of transect length. And our plots are based on 3 25-meter transects laid out in these various forms. The methods themselves are grouped into several categories: core methods that are always collected in every site, contingent methods that are collected if the BLM deems them appropriate or of interest, and annual use methods that are designed to monitor the extent of use by livestock or other ungulates in a single growing season. The Lentic protocol is actually the only AIM protocol that includes these use measurements and allows BLM to collect data on use at the same time as long-term condition data. Along with those response variables, the protocol also includes several covariate methods that help to classify and describe each site. So here's a little bit more about the methods themselves. The vegetation methods, most of our core methods are focused on vegetation in the wetlands. We do a full and complete species inventory to record all species that we see within the plot. And then we take detailed vegetation composition and cover measures along the 3 25-meter transects using a line point intercept method that is adapted from the terrestrial AIM methods, but with a few changes that are better suited to lentic or wetland habitats. We also collect data on vegetation heights, ground surface attributes, litter and water depths, and we have a protocol for measuring woody structure if there is woody vegetation in sites. Our contingent methods, we have 2 contingent methods that are monitored if applicable and desired by BLM. The first is a series of measurements about hummocks, which are mounds that can be created by ungulate trampling, especially in sites with either organic or fine textured soils. And they can lead to wetland degradation through soil compaction, erosion, and dewatering. We measure a variety of data about hummocks when they are encountered, and includes the number of hummocks along a transect, their height, their width, their slope on the leading edge, and whether they are vegetated or bare. The second contingent method is water quality. We collect in situ pH specific conductance and temperature in both surface and groundwater if it's encountered. And we'll take a grab sample for total nitrogen and phosphorus only from surface water if it's present within the plot. And then the annual use methods are adapted from BLM's multiple indicator monitoring framework, and they are used to measure grazing impacts within a single season. And those include woody species use, stubble height, which is the grazed portion of graminoid vegetation, and then soil alteration or hoof prints in the site. And then our covariate data includes soils and hydrology, looking at the texture and the color of soil horizons to determine if there are indicators of hydric conditions or wetted soils. And then a description of site hydrology, including water sources, seasonality, characteristics of surface water throughout the site. And we use those covariate data to build a comprehensive description and classification of the site using several different classification systems, including generalized wetland type, like those I mentioned in the slide before. We also look at the hydrogeomorphic classification of the wetland and the coordinate or National Wetlands Inventory classification of the wetland. And those help bin the sites in similar bins so that we're comparing like systems with like systems during analysis. So now that you've heard a little bit about the protocol that was developed during phase 1, I'm going to talk a little bit about phase 2 of the Lentic AIM development, and that is pilot implementation, which has began in 2019 and is going through this year, 2021. During pilot implementation, our team at CNHP has been working with BLM to create sample designs, selecting sites to sample from existing wetland mapping or from known high priority wetlands on the ground. We've been testing and implementing electronic data capture. We've been developing training materials and finalizing the protocol, which we hope to publish this winter. In 2019, CNHP led crews in Colorado and Utah to collect the first 64 points of Lentic AIM data. And in the fall of that year, BLM hired a new riparian ecologist at the National Operations Center to lead the Lentic AIM program from within BLM. Up until that point, it was the Lentic AIM project was sort of a side project on the margins of the larger AIM program. And by when the new riparian ecologist named Lindsay Reynolds was hired to the National Operations Center, it really fully brought the Lentic AIM program into the bigger AIM family. So we've been working over the last year and a half to become more fully integrated into the AIM program. In 2020, last summer, CNHP led crews in Colorado, Utah, and Idaho to sample an additional 64 points. We didn't know we were going to sample exactly the same number in 2020. We actually hoped it would be about double that, but due to COVID-19, we scaled back our sampling plans. We had hoped to be in an additional 3 states, but COVID threw us a curveball, and we were still very pleased to get out to the 3 states where we worked. And then in 2021, we are now gearing up to sample in 7 different states across the West. CNHP will lead 5 of those teams in California, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. And we're partnering with the University of Montana to collect data in Idaho and Montana this year. So back to those pieces of what we've put together in phase 2. Phase 2 has included developing sample designs for Lentic AIM sampling. Probability-based designs are randomly selected sites where every member of the target population has a known probability of being selected. So here's an example of probability-based design in Idaho that we used this year. Randomly generated sites give us the ability to roll up the results and produce statistically valid estimates at a landscape scale. But we've also done quite a bit of targeted sampling, which is deliberately selecting sites that are targeted due to management concerns or recent or upcoming management actions, such as restoration. Both of these types of sampling are really important for BLM to understand resource conditions. We've worked on developing an electronic data capture system that is in line with what terrestrial and Lodic AIM, the methods that they use. That has been developed through the programs of Survey 123 on tablets. Data are collected through Survey 123 forms on tablets and then fed to the cloud via ArcGIS Online and the collector application, so that as soon as the data are uploaded, then folks back in the office can review data that's collected, and all the data can be housed in one system. We have also developed training materials and carried out trainings each year during phase 2. In 2019, we held the training in Colorado between Grand Junction and Glenwood Springs. In 2020, we managed to pull off a COVID-safe training in Ridge County, Utah. As you can see, we're all wearing our masks. And then in 2020, we're now planning for 2 trainings, one in Nevada and one in Wyoming. So here's a look at the sites that we were able to sample in 2019 and 2020. We sampled 59 sites in Colorado, 48 in Utah, and 21 in Idaho. Zooming in a bit closer to home, here's our 59 sites sampled between 2019 and 2020 in Colorado. We sampled across all 3 BLM districts. We did generate random points from National Wetlands Inventory mapping, and we're able to evaluate the accuracy and effectiveness of using NWI mapping for probabilistic surveys. And then we also sampled quite a few targeted points that were selected to address site-specific monitoring goals, such as permit renewals, vegetation treatment effectiveness, sensitive species habitat, and restoration monitoring. I thought I would give a little bit of a taste of the data that we've collected here in Colorado. It's a bit of a delay when I hit my button, sorry about that. So of our 59 sites in Colorado, we sampled 18 riparian shrublands, 11 springs, 11 wet meadows, 9 fens, 6 marshes, 3 vegetated drainage ways, and 1 playa. So wide variety of sites in different ecoregions across the state, from low elevation to high elevation. In 2020, here's some statistics on our plant community in the sites that we sampled. 219 unique taxa identified with an average of 28 species per site. Of those, 12% on average were non-native, and the remaining 88 were native. The most commonly observed species is Juncus arcticus, which will be no surprise to anyone that's spent time on BLM land. And here's a taste of the spectrum of sites that they sampled this past summer. Cinnamon Pass Fen actually had the lowest species diversity of only 11 species, but 100% of them were native. This is a very high elevation fen in the mountains of the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. Going to Reeder Creek outside of Kremling with a high species diversity of 66 species, of which 85% were native. And then just to give a taste of some of the more interesting, I think important types of sites that we sample, these are a couple sites we sampled in the Badger Creek watershed in central Colorado. And these are part of a large-scale restoration effort in that watershed. And we were able to sample 1 site post-restoration and 1 site pre-restoration. They were a few miles apart, and this kind of information and repeated sampling of these sites over time can really help BLM understand how restoration efforts are changing their resources. This is a system where there is some down cutting and there were what's called wetland speed bumps or sod bumps installed to slow water in Upper Badger Creek and to develop more wetland habitat, widen the channels and slow down the water. And that type of restoration will also occur in the Lower Badger Creek area in a couple of years. So the next phase of lentic development won't start until 2022, but we are gearing up for that phase as well. The big change that will happen starting in 2022 for lentic AIM is that crews will be managed by outside contractors, of which we may be one for a couple states, but we will essentially release, up until this point, we have managed crews doing most of the sampling for lentic AIM. But starting in 2022, there will likely be multiple crews per state and hopefully hundreds of sites sampled each year. We will be expanding over the next few years to all 12 Western states, including Alaska, which will be quite an adventure. And our data will be fully integrated into the AIM enterprise database. Our continued role, CNHP's continued role as the outside science partner, will be to create sample designs, to refine the electronic data capture and supporting tools, train crews and BLM staff, and to assist with data analysis and interpretation. And now I just want to briefly mention our partnership on the other side, one of the other legs of the AIM triangle, which is Lodic data collection around the same time that we got involved in developing the Lentic AIM protocol. We also started serving as a contract crew manager for some of the Lodic AIM crews. So we've been managing Lodic AIM sampling or stream sampling in Utah from 2018 through to the present. We served as the managers for Colorado Lodic AIM data collection in 2019 and also picked up part of Wyoming Lodic AIM sampling in 2020, and that is also continuing. So we've been able to have crews on the ground sampling streams in all these environments, which has given us a really terrific perspective on how lentic areas, the wetland and riparian areas, interact with the streams that they may or may not be located near. Not all wetlands are located near streams, but many are in the BLM landscape. Lodic AIM methods focus mostly on the physical habitat and involve measurements of channel widths, floodplain connectivity, bank stability and cover, canopy cover, stream bed particle size, pool dimensions, woody debris, as well as water quality, benthic macroinvertebrate sampling, riparian vegetation, and measures of human influence. Here's a couple of our crew members out sampling up in Wyoming this past summer. And what's really been important for BLM and for CNHP is the intersection between lentic and Lodic sampling. We've had a few examples in the past couple of years where we've collected lentic AIM data, the wetland data, within floodplains adjacent to stream reaches where there's also Lodic AIM data collection. The Lodic AIM or stream monitoring really focuses on the channel itself, the stability of the channel, the physical habitat of the channel. And the Lentic AIM sampling goes beyond that green line and tracks vegetation metrics across the floodplain. So these two data sets can really be used well together. This is an example of Holly Creek in the Salmon Field office in Idaho, where restoration took place I believe in 2016. Here's before the restoration, where beaver dam analogs were installed, and then after the installation. And we've now installed a lentic monitoring plot there to monitor the expansion of wetland vegetation across the floodplain. Here's another example from Utah, the Otter Creek drainage in the Richfield Field Office in Utah. This is an area where they're hoping to do some restoration. And we had crews sample both the stream channels through the Lodic method and then a lentic monitoring plot on the floodplain. And these protocols can be used together. So the Lodic AIM data found that there were high fine sediments in the channel, and the vegetation plots immediate to the banks found high cover of non-native species. By sampling up on the floodplain using Lentic AIM, we were able to add additional information, such as the percent of folio cover and the percent of non-native species. And there's a whole suite of other indicators that we can look at together using these two methods in the same locations. So that concludes my discussion of our partnerships between both the Lentic and the Lodic AIM programs at BLM. And again, there's a large group of us who have been working on these efforts. And I would be happy to answer any questions either now or if anyone wants to follow up. I have provided my email address there. I'd be happy to discuss any questions you have. Hopefully I still have a bit of time.
You do, Joanna. You do have some time. And before I let you field questions, I'm going to apologize for a slightly rambling introduction. As I'm borrowing a new laptop this morning, I forgot to check if notification sounds were set. So between asking everybody to check in and emails coming into an inbox, it sounded like a video game going off behind my ears. So I apologize that my introduction did not include our parent organization, NatureServe. So there's a host of organizations, the natural heritage programs, they're all kind of under this umbrella of the nature serve. So I apologize, I left out. And thanks those in the background, Andrea and others who reminded me the International Women's Day theme is choose to challenge. So with that, I had a few that if you're willing to entertain while we await other questions is, you talked about the BLM's process for assessing qualities. What other federal land managers had developed similar systems? This seems like a very rigorous system. Have other federal land management agencies developed ones, and how do they communicate?
That is a great question, Rob. I can speak to that a little bit. So there are obviously federal land management agencies, and then there's the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, which does not actually manage any lands. But EPA has developed a very rigorous method and carries that out every 5 years. It's called the National Wetland Condition Assessment. And then EPA has encouraged many state agencies to develop their own wetland assessment methods. And we've been very involved in that data collection. AIM differs from National Wetland Condition Assessment in the vegetation data collection method is different. AIM uses a line point intercept along a transect. NWCA EPA protocols is a plot-based method. So we have 5 10 by 10 meter plots in, so smaller vegetation plots in what's called an assessment area, but both sample a chunk of land rather than a whole wetland. So they similarly select sites, but collect a little bit different data. We're actually, this is a NWCA year, National Wetland Condition Assessment year. It happens every 5 years, and CNHP will be leading the sampling in Colorado and Wyoming for that project. And because we've got our hands in both projects, we're actually going to co-locate a series of sites using BLM monitoring protocols and NWCA protocols. So both BLM and EPA and us as CNHP are very interested in how those protocols compare. So that's EPA. The Park Service has done quite a bit of work monitoring wetlands in their park units. One thing that's different about the Park Service's approach is that they have defined methods. The Park Service monitoring program is divided up into networks. So the parks within Colorado are part of the Rocky Mountain Network, and they've defined protocols at the network level. So a series of parks within a network might be monitored with the same protocols, but if you went to the Everglades, they would monitor their wetlands in a very different way. So one thing that I think has been very powerful about AIM is they've decided to collect all data across all lands in exactly the same way. Even though there is variability and diversity within the wetlands, our goal has always been to keep our eyes on same methods that can be applicable in all these different environments so that we can speak at across the BLM lands. Fish and Wildlife Service, similar to the Park Service, has their own specific wetland monitoring protocols.
It sounds like you might be set to understand how those all could communicate. All right, I'm getting a couple of questions about access. So Andrea and Christine are asking, is AIM available, and how might people be able to review that data? Those data?
The data, yes. Yes, there is a website. There is a public-facing portal of AIM data. And I should have that website off the top of my head, but if you Google landscape toolbox AIM, there is a website that's devoted to the AIM program. It's hosted by the Jornada. Actually, it's interestingly not a BLM website, but there is a data access page there that can get you to the portal.
Is it landscapetoolbox.org?
It is actually aim.landscape.toolbox. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, thank you, Ruth. So yes, there is a set of data that are available to the public. There is more detailed information is available inside the BLM firewall, but yes, data are available.
Okay, I'm going to hit you with the topic. We've still got some time, so I'm going to keep hitting you until you tell me you have to leave. Wetlands have been in the news recently.
Yes.
Can you tell us what the changes that are coming about for how we consider wetlands, how that's relevant to us, and how is that relevant for your work?
Yes, so wetlands have been in the news, largely from a regulatory perspective. During the Trump administration, the EPA issued a new rule defining waters of the US, which includes wetlands, and that rule defines which wetlands. It does not actually define what wetlands are. Wetlands have been defined by the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA for several decades, and there are a number of criteria that we use to, in the field, find the boundaries of wetlands. But what the waters of the US rule and the Trump administration's interpretation of that, called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, it defines which wetlands fall under federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. So which wetlands the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA has the jurisdiction to regulate across the country. And it's not regulation of all impacts. What's important to know is that it's only regulation of the discharge of fill materials, so filling in a wetland. It does not regulate activities that might starve a wetland of water. So there's not fully a wetlands protection rule. But as part of the Clean Water Act, EPA and Army Corps of Engineers have jurisdiction to protect federal waters of the US from discharge of fill material. And the Trump administration's 2020 rule narrowed the definition in many ways of what the feds have the jurisdiction to protect. And so that has led to a number of conversations within states and within the conservation community about protecting those waters that have now lost federal jurisdiction. And in Colorado, as one, is a state that's been really looking at that question and whether additional protection should be applied at the state level. And there's a lot more to say there, but hopefully that is an answer to why they've been in the news recently. And everybody is now wondering whether the Biden administration will make a different action. But I do not think anything will happen very quickly. And so this question still remains of what to do with unprotected wetlands. Right.
But you do foresee a possible change.
Folks in the know think there is the possibility of a change, but it's really difficult to predict what that might look like because rulemaking is a long, drawn-out process.
I think I may have opened up a bag of a box of worms here, a can of worms, sorry. It sounds like Stephanie's coming. The state of Colorado had to stay against that rule.
Yes. In fact, Colorado was, I didn't know how specific to get into this, but Colorado was actually the only state across the nation where that rule was put on hold because of a lawsuit. And so we were the only state still functioning under the previous regulatory guidance. That rule was actually just lifted last week. I forget which day, maybe Wednesday, or but it was just lifted. And so we are now under the 2020 rule, and I don't know the specifics as to exactly what date that's applicable, but so it is a very live conversation within the state of Colorado.
Michael has a great question, and this might be our last one, but have you found any particular exceptional examples of rare wetlands? And are there certain types of wetlands that are most under threat?
Specifically on BLM land, I think that's a really good question. There is a lot of diversity of wetlands on BLM land. One of the things that we are really seeing is how many systems are groundwater dependent and groundwater driven, both from small seeps and springs to larger systems that are fed by a series of groundwater discharge, points of groundwater discharge. And those systems are, I think, important in the dry landscape of the arid West. I think
You stumped me.
well, I'm trying to figure out how to say, how to respond to that in the most sort of fair and comprehensive way across BLM lands. I mean, BLM lands, those of you who have spent time in BLM lands, they are multiple use lands. And so there's certainly use in many of these sites. It's unusual. Colorado BLM land goes up to some pretty high elevation where you get some more pristine wetlands, but I would say across BLM lands there is a fair amount of use, and so that's part of why this monitoring is so essential, is to understand the appropriate level of use in these systems and how to balance the economic drivers of grazing and other actions, oil and gas development on BLM land with the long-term protection of these resources. But yeah, I've been amazed and fascinated by the diversity of sites, the springs that pop up out of the desert in Utah. I wish I could pull some of my Utah folks up onto the screen now and have them talk about some of these amazing, both cool and warm water springs that really just pop out of nowhere in the desert. So there's some very, very interesting and important sites on BLM land.
So I'm hearing you tell us there's going to be a separate seeps and springs conversation and their value, and you can start tagging people on your team for that next presentation.
Yes, yes.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to tell us this story. This is really helpful for many of us who work in these systems to understand the diversity and value of them on some of our multi-use lands. And everybody out there, appreciate you joining us today. Please connect with us again in 2 weeks. We have another conversation about the stuff that Colorado Natural Heritage Program is doing. And be safe and enjoy International Women's Day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.